Will you pray with me? Through my words, O God, and in our hearts, show us your faithfulness. Amen. Please be seated. When we tell a story in our Sunday school classes, after the end of the story, there are some wondering questions that are asked. And almost always, one of them is some variant on, I wonder if there is any part of this story that we could take out and still have all that we need. I think about that with the story of Jesus walking on the water, because I don't always know that we need it. Jesus' other miracles all seem to be directed at helping someone, at meeting a need in the world. He heals the sick. He casts out the demons. Just last week, he multiplied the loaves and fishes to feed thousands of people. But this doesn't serve anyone. I mean, it helps Peter, but in fairness, Peter wouldn't have gotten into the water if Jesus weren't on top of it. So it's this weird little story that Jesus seems to be showing off, for lack of a better term. And what's been happening up until this point, remember, is that first, Jesus heard about the death of his friend, John the Baptist. And then he tried to get away, tried to have some time by himself, but being Jesus, he really couldn't go anywhere alone. So he was followed by the crowds, and he has compassion on them, and he teaches them, and then he feeds them with the loaves and the fishes. And now, finally, he gets a moment by himself. And maybe that's the why of this. He puts the disciples in the boat and says, go across the other side of the river, get away. And he tells the crowds to go back to where they were. And he's left by himself. And he goes up on the mountaintop to pray. And then coming back, he's in a bit of a bind. Because in his haste to be alone, he has sent the disciples to the other side of the lake. He sent the crowds away. The only way for him to get around would be to walk all the way around to the other side of the lake, which would take a lot longer than just going across as the disciples did. And I imagine him not being thrilled about, not being thrilled about the idea of his disciples being unsupervised for that long. And so he does the only thing there is to do. He just walks across the top of the lake, walks along the sea. And his disciples see this. They see him coming, and they're terrified. They're terrified because this doesn't make any sense. This isn't something that happens. They're not totally sure if it's Jesus or if it's just someone who maybe looks like him, or someone or something that is trying to mess with them and trick them into jumping out into the water. And he tells them, take heart. It's I, it's me. Don't be afraid. And Peter has this kind of moment where you can almost hear him doing the math in his head, where he's thinking, okay, there's somebody out there. They're definitely walking on the water. If it's a ghost or some kind of demon or spirit or whatever, then they couldn't make me come out and walk on the water with them. That's something only Jesus could do. And so he puts Jesus to the test in this way. He says, if it's really you, then command me to walk out to you. And then I'll know when I'm, leaving footprints in the water. I'll know that it's you. And Jesus simply says, come. and Peter gets out. And Matthew doesn't tell us really exactly what happened, just that he started to walk toward Jesus. Now, I don't know if that's kind of what a lot of us imagine, which is, him stepping gingerly out of the boat and his feet finding purchase somehow on the water, and he takes the other foot out, and he's really doing it. He's walking until he starts to look around and notice the wind and the waves and gets terrified and sinks. Or if it's one of those like Wile E. Coyote moments when he runs off the cliff and it's not until he looks down that he starts to fall because he just hasn't even noticed that he's doing it. Or if it's just him kind of stepping out and saying, I think I can really do it, never mind. But whatever happens, he falls. And he turns to Jesus and says, save me, Lord. And Jesus reaches out a hand and lifts him up. You of little faith, why did you doubt? And on the one hand, this is a wonderful story about the power of faith. Because sometimes, indeed, Jesus does call us to do impossible things. Sometimes Jesus does ask us, invite us to take a step out in faith. And if we allow ourselves to be distracted by all of the reasons that what Jesus is asking us to do is impossible, we won't be able to do it. But if we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, we will find that we can walk on the water, literally or metaphorically. And if you don't believe that that's true, the evidence is literally all around you. This building, as some of us who are here remember, was once a dream, was once an idea, was once an impossible thought as we were huddled in the old church building down on Route 1 and thought we need more space, we need a parking lot. But it was this impossible dream, this impossible idea, until we stepped out in faith and started to do the things that eventually led to this place being here. So we know that sometimes Jesus calls us to do impossible things and to remain fixed on the vision in front of us and not to think about, well, where are we going to find the land and where are we going to find the money and who's going to build it for us and how will we possibly agree on what the sanctuary should look like? If we focus only on the things that we can't do, we'll never understand what we can do. And this is wonderful. It's beautiful. It's a great story of faith, but I worry. I worry because it encourages us sometimes to put our faith in an outcome. And that, I think, is the distinction between what we might call blind faith and faithfulness. Blind faith is trusting that we are in charge of making sure this happens, by trusting that if we do the right things, the right outcome will happen. And that is scary. That's a scary thought to have, because what happens when the outcome doesn't happen? What happens when you are praying by that hospital bed and your loved one dies anyway? What happens when you are trusting and believing and doing all of the right things and still the goodness of your life seems to slip through your fingers? If our trust, if our faith is in an outcome, we run the risk of being disappointed. And worse than that, we run the risk of blaming ourselves. Because surely, if Peter had just kept his eyes on Jesus, he could be walking on the water. Surely, if we had just prayed more, been more faithful, given more, supported more, done better, our lives would be easier. But it doesn't always work that way, does it? And so that's the distinction, I think. What Peter shows us, what Jesus shows us, is the importance not of blind faith in the outcome of walking on the water, but rather of faithfulness to Jesus, of trusting not in an outcome, but in the person and life of Jesus Christ. That's how Peter got into the water, and more importantly, that's how Peter got out of the water. when his trust, his blind faith in his own ability to walk on water, if he were just faithful enough, when that failed, he reached out, not to an outcome, not to a manifestation of his desires, but to the person of Jesus. He didn't need a reminder of how to hold his gaze on Jesus. He needed someone to pull him out of the ocean. And that's what he asked for. And that's what he got. Because he needed the person of Jesus. He needed someone whose faithfulness in him and to him could be matched by his own faithfulness to Jesus. We are called sometimes to go and do difficult things. Sometimes they feel impossible. Sometimes they are impossible. Sometimes we fail. And when that happens, and it's not an if but a when that happens, when the storm is too great, when our lives are too difficult, we cannot trust that everything is going to be okay. What we can trust is Jesus. What we can trust is that when everything is categorically not okay, we can still cry out, "Save me, Lord," and place our trust and our lives in the outstretched hand of Jesus. Not because it will make everything better. Peter was not lifted up to walk again on the water. Peter was lifted up and placed in the boat, brought to safety. He was stayed with Jesus. That's what we receive when we cry out, is the presence of God, walking alongside us, lifting us out of those difficult places that we find ourselves in, sometimes through no fault of our own. We find ourselves carried by the love of God. That's what faithfulness is. Not just our trust in the person of Jesus, but Jesus' faithfulness and steadfastness to us. We know that however deep the water gets, however hard the storm blows, we will never be abandoned. We may get wet, but we won't be alone. We always can reach out and put our faith, our trust, not in an outcome, but in the hands of Jesus himself. Amen.